As I am sure you are very much aware, society has changed tremendously over the past 100 years or so, and it continues to change at what sometimes feels like an astonishingly rapid pace. One of the consequences of this has been that the experience of being an individual human being living in society has changed tremendously during this time as well. Now this much is uncontroversial, I suspect. Behind these observations, though, lies a question that is, I think, much more troubling. Does this mean that human nature itself, and with it what it means to be a human being, has also changed over the past 100 years or so as a result of these changes in society? Now this is an important question for us because in many ways it lies behind all the debates, all the struggles for rights and recognition, and all the texts we are going to be covering this week. And this is so because people's sense of their own identity, and certainly of the identity that society and other people tend to thrust upon us as individuals, this sense is often determined by one or more of the categories I have placed on the screen. And it's important for us then to be aware that the understanding, rights, experiences and practices of all these categories have undergone significant changes in the English-speaking world in the period since 1900. I'm going to run very quickly through these categories to give you a sense of how much the experience of inhabiting one or other of them has changed, although of course for the majority of this lesson we will be focusing on the category of gender. But let's just see how the experience of age has changed dramatically. If we start at the beginning of life, I think we all feel that we know what it means to be a child and to have a childhood. It comes as something of a shock then when historians tell us that our idea of childhood is probably a 19th century, or at the earliest a late 18th century invention. This is illustrated by the fact that children's literature, at least as we know it today, does not seem to come into existence until the late 19th century. To summarize the history of childhood enormously, it seems quite simply that before the 18th century, children were not seen as people in their own right. All the qualities we now attribute to children, those of innocence, of being people in their own rights, whose development and experiences will importantly shape the person we are to become, many of these, at least in the way we understand them, seem to have been absent from earlier notions of childhood. Whether you read Shakespeare or anything older than that, and it includes depiction of children, it tends to support the idea that children were not people in their own right, they were simply incomplete, and therefore to a degree deficient adults. And it has to be pointed out that in this regard they were often lumped with women and savages. We have to remember too that, especially if these children came from one of the lower classes, they could well be put to work at an early age, working on farms, working as servants in wealthy people's households, being sent down coal mines or up chimneys, and so on. In Britain, for example, it was not until 1880, just 20 years before our period begins, that education became compulsory for all children between the ages of 5 and 10. And it wasn't for another 40 years until 1921 that the upper age limit was raised to 16, which is what it is today. This, of course, marks a very dramatic change in what it feels to be a child. But for some of us, at least, it's helpful even to compare our own childhoods, the kind of things we did, the kind of expectations that were made of us, with children today. Perhaps even in this relatively short time, things have changed there as well. So the experience of being of a different age is something that has changed dramatically. I could talk at equal length about the experience of being old. For example, the growing tendency no longer to look after old people within our own homes, but to move them into residential homes. The right of old people not to work, but to have pensions. All these kinds of things have changed and shaped the experience of being old. That's enough about age though. What if we move on to class? Now this is a very slippery category that has shifted over time. We tend to think that there are three classes: the upper class, the middle class and the lower class, though of course there are many variations within each of these classes too. At certain periods of time during the period of this course, class structures have been more rigid than others. Certain periods of time there has been greater class mobility than others. There's a great concern in Britain at the moment, for example, that social mobility is currently being reduced rather than enhanced. Cuts in the size of the welfare state, indeed in the state as a whole, some people would argue have made it harder for people from more deprived backgrounds to gain access to the kind of education and other opportunities afforded to people from wealthier backgrounds. But more fundamental than that, ideas about what classes have changed dramatically too. After all, how is it that we define class? This too has changed over time. If we ask, for example, what does it mean to be working class today? This raises all kinds of further questions. Is your class, for example, determined by the kind of job you do? Is it determined by how much you are paid? These two factors do not always correlate. Is it determined, on the other hand, by the kinds of attitudes that you hold, your political persuasions, your education? Could it be determined by something rather seemingly more trivial, such as your taste in clothing, whether you own or rent a house, whether you have cable television? More positive characterizations of the working class would suggest that working class people tend to be more honest, more authentic. They live in close-knit communities and feel rooted in their local environments. These are all different ways of defining class, and they all contrast and compete with one another. And this greater complexity is reflected in the increasing complexity governments and other organizations use to try to calculate class. In the written part of this lesson you will see a link here to a BBC, what they called the Great British Class Calculator, where you can see the kind of questions they use to determine which class you are. And there's also an article talking about class in the United States. So like age, in short, class, which is often used to identify us, has changed greatly too.